Well, good afternoon. My name is Leela Gandhi, and I am the Shona McKee Stark Director of the Pembroke Center and Professor of Humanities and English. On behalf of the Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women, I'm delighted to welcome you for our first event of the academic year. Panel discussion, Reproductive Justice After Roe versus Wade. Although the struggle to access to abortion care is not new, since June 24, the topic of reproductive justice has acquired a feeling of particular urgency. Today's panel is a reflection of the Pembroke Center's ongoing commitment to the health of women and all people adversely impacted by reproductive health disparities. This is a theme you'll see echoed throughout our programming this year. On Wednesday, October 19 at 6:15, we are co-sponsoring a virtual conversation with the Sarah Doyle Center for Women and Gender entitled, What Next? Reproductive Justice in a Post-Roe Nation. We encourage you to join and further this important conversation. I also want, from the bottom of my heart, to thank the friends of the Pembroke Center for generously supporting today's event, as well as our co-sponsors, Brown's Women Network and the Sarah Doyle Center for Women and Gender. Now, I want to briefly introduce you to my colleague, Madina Agénor, our moderator for today's panel. Professor Agénor is a Brown alumna, class of 05, and assistant professor in the Department of Behavioral and Social Sciences here at Brown. Professor Agénor's research focuses on the structural and social determinants of sexual and reproductive health and cancer screening and prevention among multiply marginalized populations. She has a particular focus on the health of sexual minority cisgender women, transgender and gender diverse peoples, and Black, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer peoples. In 2022 and 2023, the current academic year, Professor Agénor is a faculty fellow at the Brown Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. We're so happy to have her guide us through this critical dialogue. She will introduce our speakers. Please join me in welcoming her. To begin from wherever she is seated.
Thank you so much, Leela. That was a wonderful introduction to the event and also to the moment in which we find ourselves. So it's an honor and a pleasure to be with all of you today, and thank you so much for coming out in person. Despite this rain, it has not stopped you, so we're delighted that you're here. And also thank you to everyone joining us online for the live stream. We're also grateful that you're here with us today. So again, today I have the absolute distinct honor to welcome our three esteemed panelists who will each provide remarks on the landscape of reproductive health, rights, and justice in the context of the post-Roe versus Wade era. So first, right to my left, we'll hear from Marcela Howell, who is founder and president of In Our Own Voice, National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda. Then we'll hear from Lisa Ikemoto, Martin Luther King Jr. professor at UC Davis School of Law, and she will share her remarks. And last but not least, we'll hear from Nancy Northup, president and CEO of the Center for Reproductive Rights. And following their presentations, we will have a chance to hear from all of you. So we will have a Q&A with the audience. Okay, so first up, I will have the pleasure to introduce Marcela Howell, who is the founder and president of In Our Own Voice, National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda, which is a national and state partnership of 8 Black women's reproductive justice organizations that has the goal of lifting up the voices of Black leaders on reproductive health, rights, and justice. An advocate and policy strategist, Marcela is widely recognized for her expertise in strategic communications, leadership development, and policy forecasting. With over 40 years of experience advocating for women's rights, reproductive justice, and women's empowerment, she is devoted to enhancing the role of Black women in national policy debates on issues impacting their lives. Marcela was formerly the Vice President of Policy, Communications, and Marketing at Advocates for Youth, where she was responsible for strategic planning on international, federal, and state policy and outreach to national and international media as well on issues of adolescent sexual and reproductive health. She is also the author of Walk in My Shoes, a Black activist guide to surviving the women's movement, a collection of, I love that title, so good, a collection of inspirational essays to help young Black women navigate the women's movement and empower them to become leaders in the fight for reproductive justice. So please join me in welcoming Marcela Howell.
I wasn't kidding. Is this on? This is on, right? You can hear me. Okay. I wasn't kidding when I said it needed updating. It does. Thank you very much. And I want to thank everyone for inviting me here. This is my first trip to Rhode Island. I expected it to be nice and sunny. I will have to come back another time when it is, but I want to thank you very much for inviting me. I've been asked to talk a little bit about the meaning of reproductive justice, because one of the things as coming out of the Dobbs decision that I've discovered is that people don't clearly understand reproductive justice, and it's been sort of conflated with abortion rights and family planning, and it is not. It is much broader than that. In fact, I'm going to give you a little history, a really quick history, as to where the term came from. And I don't know how many people have taken courses and they've heard about reproductive justice and the 12 Black women who were at a conference in Chicago that was a conference that was convened by women's groups and the Ms. Foundation to really talk about healthcare, because it was at the time when the Clinton administration was thinking about this big healthcare plan. And these women came together to talk about what they wanted to make sure was included in that. And it was predominantly white women at the meeting. There were some Black women, there were some API women, there were some Latinas, but for the most part, it was predominantly white women. And these Black women who were there, the 12 who finally decided to go meet in a hotel room for quite some time and came up with the phrase reproductive justice, felt that they were not being talked about in this meeting, that there was things that were missing. And one of the things that they were clear that was missing was their lived experiences. All the conversations were around accessing abortion, having the right to abortion. And for Black women, Roe v. Wade has always been the floor, not the ceiling. If you remember when the decision in 1973 on Roe v. Wade was decided, 3 years later, Congress passed the Hyde Amendment, which said anyone who was getting their health care from Medicaid could not use that insurance coverage to get abortion services. And at that point that Hyde said that and introduced this amendment, and it wasn't a law, it was an amendment to funding bills, the funding bill that funded Medicaid, he was very clear. He wanted to outlaw abortion for all people, but he couldn't, so he decided to pick on the most vulnerable, poor people. And so at that point in time, he basically was looking at Black women, Latinas, and some API women, but primarily it was Black women who were on Medicaid. And what that said was, yes, you have a legal right to something, but you don't have the right to actually have it covered. So what that said to them was, okay, now how are we supposed to access something that we have a legal right to if our insurance doesn't cover it? And so they said in this meeting in 1994, and I should add that the Hyde Amendment was introduced every single year, no matter who was in charge of Congress, no matter who was in the White House. It's not a Republican or a Democratic thing. And it was actually put back in again this year. So it is not a party thing. It is something that people, it's a politician thing. That's the best I can say. And so what happened was these women were sitting in this meeting and they decided they were being ignored. And so they went to, one of them rented a room so all of them could meet, and they spent their time thinking about what any kind of health care package would mean to them. And what they said was, reproductive rights is great, but there's social justice issues too. And so reproductive justice combined those things. They basically merge reproductive rights and social justice. So reproductive justice is a broader sense. It is grounded in human rights and Black feminist theory. And what it says is we have the right to control our bodies, our work, our families, our communities, our gender, and our reproduction. And so we look at reproductive justice as this thing that is separate. Many people after the Dobbs decision kept talking about the reproductive health rights and justice movement. There is not a reproductive health rights and justice movement. There are movements. And reproductive rights is a movement, reproductive health is a movement. They merge very often. Reproductive justice is its own entity. It is a movement that looks at the lived experience of people of color in this country. And it merges things like environmental justice, criminal justice, housing, education. It takes all of those things that come into effect. We do a lot of polling. Our organization does a lot of polling of Black women. And we always ask a question: what do you think of when you are thinking about having a child or expanding your family? And people will come up with, well, a good job, health care would be nice, but they also come up with ensuring that I have access to clean water, ensuring that I have access to quality, affordable food, ensuring that there are trees in my community so that the heat index is not so high, ensuring that there is not over-policing in my community, because I would then be concerned about my child's life. And I don't want to bring a child into the world if they are always threatened by police. There are all these different kinds, making sure that I have good housing, whether it's a house or an apartment, but making sure that there are good city services that actually are for my community. There are all these different things. There's also voting rights. Voting rights always comes up really high. We did a poll just recently where we asked people what were the things that they were the issues that were most important to them to get them to come out and vote in this November election. And the top issue was racial justice. It wasn't abortion rights. It was racial justice. It was health care, which they interpreted as including all of these different things. But when we asked them specifically about abortion rights, it dropped very far down. When we asked them about ensuring that women had control over their bodies, it jumped up by 16 to 19 points. So Black women are probably the most supportive about abortion rights. They just talk about it differently. And if you understand that they talk about it in a much more holistic way, you get that this is what this is about, that reproductive justice is, when we talk about intersectionality, we're talking about all of these things that impact how you live your life, whether or not your family can thrive in the community that you live in. And so that's what reproductive justice is, and it's why it's a movement unto itself. It incorporates reproductive rights and health, but we're not the same movement. And so in that sense, it's very important that people understand that. One of the questions that we ask people, whether they agree on or disagree in terms of our poll, is whether they agree that having control over your body is an important factor in financial stability for your family. 91% of Black women in every single poll we've done, and we've been doing polling since 2011, and every single poll, that number is somewhere between 91 and 95. In terms of people believing that having that right to control your own body, determining your own bodily autonomy is a big factor in financial stability of their family and of themselves. And so it does bring in rights, it does bring in health, and it also brings in a whole lot of other things that we have to be able to understand and know that when we're talking about reproductive justice, as this title is, we are not just talking about two things. We are talking about a broad range of things, and understanding that better tells us that we should do different things. One of the other big factors that comes up is voting rights, because Black women don't believe that if you can't vote for the people who represent your values, you don't have any rights. And if nothing else, conservative politicians understand that. There's a reason they went after the Voting Rights Act. There's a reason why the Supreme Court went after the Voting Rights Act. People keep saying that overturning Roe is the first time that the court has actually taken away a right that it had been given. That's not true. When they gutted the Voting Rights Act, they took away my rights as a citizen in this country, my right to vote. And we see it in the laws that are being passed in the states. If you look at what's happening in the states, it's abortion bans, restrictions on voting rights, and attacks on LGBTQ youth. There's a reason. Those are all cultural things that say we get to determine who's important in our country. One of the other pieces is the banning of books and the changing of American history, because we don't want to have certain things taught in our schools because it might make our children feel uncomfortable. You go, well, maybe it's really about you feeling embarrassed about the things that this country has done to other people. And so all of those things factor in. And I just wanted to say that in that framework. Oh, the other thing I want to say is that these 12 Black women, one of them has passed away, so our organization is actually producing a documentary about those 12 Black women, because those voices need to be heard before they pass away. Most of them are pretty old. They're about my age, so they're kind of old. But I'm older than you think, so they're pretty old. And the reality is that when we think about the civil rights movement, there are certain pictures that come, Pettus Bridge, John Lewis getting beat by police, dogs being turned loose on children, water hoses, the Freedom Riders, Martin Luther King. When we think about the reproductive justice movement, we don't have a visual. And we need to have a visual so that people understand what it really means and why it's important to this country. So we're going to do a documentary. We're talking to directors and producers right now to get this done in the next year so that there is a visual when people talk about the reproductive justice movement, so that folks know, and we'll make sure Brown University gets a copy of it and you can show them in your classes and stuff, and know what it really is. And we're going to be interviewing all of the 11 women who are still alive, doing interviews with them and doing interviews with people who know them, to talk about exactly why they decided to be in that room and who they are now. Very few of them are still activists. There's only a couple of them. Most of them are doing just other things in their lives and stuff, but they were brought to that moment And that moment really changed how we view things and how we view these various movements that come together. And they also, as I said, it's a lot of different issues, social justice issues, that fall under reproductive justice. So I'll stop.
Thank you, Marcela. Should we clap? I feel like we should clap. If anything else, I will be clapping. Thank you so much for those thoughtful remarks and really thought-provoking remarks, and reminding us of the specific nature of the reproductive justice movement and, again, the specific history of where it comes from, so that we can remember the people who have gotten us here. If anything else, we need to really prioritize the leadership and voices of Black women who have enabled us to be here today, to even talk about these issues from a reproductive justice framework. So thank you for the work that you've done, and that you will be doing with this documentary. I think we're all really excited to see it. So next up, we have Nancy Northup, who is president and CEO of the Center for Reproductive Rights. And under Nancy's leadership, the center has played a key role in securing legal victories on issues such as access to maternal health, contraception, and safe abortion services, as well as the prevention of forced sterilization and child marriage in countries around the world. Nancy was previously the founding director of the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, where she litigated voting rights, campaign finance reform, and ballot access cases. From 1989 to 1996, she served as a prosecutor and deputy chief of appeals in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. And prior to that, she was a law clerk on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit Court in New Orleans. She has held many adjunct appointments, including at NYU Law School and Columbia Law, and has taught courses in constitutional and human rights law. Nancy is a member of the Brown class of 1981 and holds a JD from Columbia Law School. She is also the recipient of an honorary degree from Brown, which recognized her achievements as an attorney and a global reproductive rights leader. Please join me in welcoming Nancy Northup.
Thank you. Should be on. We'll be starting in just a moment. So thank you very much for that welcome. It is a pleasure to be on the panel with Marcela. She and I have worked together for many years, and it's a pleasure to be on with you, Lisa, who I met this morning. The three of us are all lawyers, and I think one of the things that's interesting is you're going to hear us talk about this from different angles. I am going to talk about the law. But before that, I was going to say, when I came on the Brown campus in 1977, it always stuns me that it was only 4 years after the Roe versus Wade decision. And I say it stuns me because I wasn't really thinking a lot about it when I entered campus in 1977. Now, I was coming from Western New York, so abortion had been legal in the state of New York since 1970. So perhaps that's why, I just took it for granted. But by the time I graduated in 1981, things had taken a turn. Ronald Reagan was sworn in as president in January of 1981. And that's when I started my activism on reproductive rights and on abortion rights specifically. My activism when I first came to Brown was on the South African Solidarity Committee, and we were working to get Brown to divest from investments in South Africa. And that is what kind of consumed me in my first several years. But this change in 1980, that election in which taking away the right to abortion was a central point of it, as well as a change in the position of the Republican Party on the Equal Rights Amendment, which was close to being enacted into law back in the early 80s. So I started going down to the Rhode Island State House with the Rhode Island Women's Political Caucus. And for all you students, it's one of the great things about being at Brown is that you can learn how to become a lobbyist because your state capital is in walking distance. So if you haven't done it yet, I encourage you to do that. And to just get a sense of things, could I see how many students are in the room. What's our sort of, gonna get a sense of students? Okay. And faculty administration? Great. And do we have some lawyers? Okay, not a lot. All right, so we're gonna.
Up here.
We're all up here, so we'll be speaking to that. Any health professionals in the room? Oh, wow. So, okay. Well, that's just very helpful. Oh, any aspiring lawyers in the room? Do we have any aspiring lawyers, people thinking about going to law school? Wow. Oh, my gosh. Well, and I got the law part of talking about this, but as well as Lisa will be doing that as well. So the Center for Reproductive Rights, which was founded in 1992 with the mission of ensuring that reproductive rights were protected in law, we focus on, as fundamental human rights around the world. So from our inception, we were focused not just on the issues here in the United States, but also issues elsewhere in the world. And we currently have offices in Bogota and Nairobi and Geneva, and staff also in Asia and other parts of those regions. And working on the full spectrum of reproductive rights issues, I mean, as Marcela was talking about, reproductive rights is not a euphemism for abortion rights. It means the scope of reproductive health issues, so issues like the ability to survive pregnancy by getting the kind of obstetrics care, quality of care that you need, access to contraception, access to assisted reproduction for the creation of families, and then freedom from coercion, as you were hearing about some of the work that we did on coercive sterilization and other issues. And, you know, we do this by litigating. We do a lot of litigation, both in the courts at the national level, whether here or Kenya, but also in both the regional human rights system. There's for example, an Inter-American Commission and Court of Human Rights that covers the Americas, North and South, as well as at the UN, where there's the ability to bring governments to account for violating the rights and treaties in which they have ascended. We argued the Dobbs case in the Supreme Court, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. Jackson Women's Health Organization in Jackson, Mississippi is our client for many years. And so I'll make a few reflections about where the law was before Dobbs and what the situation is today. I will say that Julie Rickleman, who argued the case, she's our litigation director, has been appointed to the United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, of which Rhode Island is part of. Good. So she had her testimony yesterday in the Senate Judiciary Committee. The way that you become a federal judge is, first of all, your state senators usually have to, you know, they have a way of nominating you, or they tell the president, we think these are some good folks. And then the president appoints, and then the Senate Judiciary Committee has a hearing. It used to be that they explored, you know, substantive areas of law to see if you're qualified. Now it's just a political show. If you've seen the Supreme Court nomination hearings in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and then the full Senate votes. So Julie had her hearing yesterday. Perhaps we hope by the end of the year that she will actually be a federal appeals court judge overseeing, among other states, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, and Puerto Rico. So I just want to say, as I said, where we were, where we are, and where we are now. So, you know, prior to Dobbs, you know, Roe versus Wade, 1973 case, the Supreme Court was 7-2. 7 justices said yes, and 2 said no. And, you know, quite simply, in a second case where they made it a little bit clearer what they were ruling on, a case called Planned Parenthood versus Casey in 1992, the Supreme Court found the right to abortion in the liberty clause of the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment protects liberty not being deprived without due process of law. And, you know, they use the term privacy, which was used in the contraception cases. So many years people always talked about a right to privacy, which we don't like that framing, and some people still use that framing because it's not about being private about something. It's about the right to control these decisions, as Marcela said, about your body and your life. And again, the Supreme Court got clear in this 1992 decision, the Casey decision, about the fact that it was liberty kind of blended with equality. So they were saying that because women, and they were talking in terms of women, but we know that people other than women can also be pregnant, so whatever your gender identity. But they were saying that women's experience with childbirth, because obviously every pregnancy is both a normal process of life, it's not an illness, but it can also cause death and morbidity, that is so central to women's ability to participate fully in the economic, social, and political life of the nation, that it is a very important fundamental liberty interest, but that equality feeling is also in there, even though they've never actually ruled that this is an issue of sex discrimination. And the thing I want to say about even let's think about it pre-1992, so the first 20 years of Roe versus Wade, as Marcela pointed out, first, the pushback started quickly, or perhaps as my own personal story, from 1977 to 1981, it got pretty intense. And as Marcela said, one of the first things that was pushed back on was stripping the ability of people who relied on the government for their health care services to be able to have access to abortion care. And there was a case called Harris versus McRae in 1980, in which they decided the issue that Marcela was talking about. You know, is it unconstitutional to deny abortion care services in the Medicaid program? And it's one of the worst decisions ever that needs to be overturned, because basically the Supreme Court in that decision said two things. The first one was sort of, so sad, too bad. You know, people living on low incomes are in no worse shape than they would be because abortion's denied than if there was no Medicaid program to begin with. So that's what you get. You get the program the government decided to give you. But the other thing that the court said, which was so outrageous, in the history of this country, with slavery, with Jim Crow segregation, was they said, the government is not responsible for problems not of its own making. And that's how they viewed poverty, a problem that was not of the government's own making. So that's all you need to know about the Harris versus McRae case. And the other population, which also, even before the Casey case, lost the ability to get access to abortion care, were people under the age of 18. So were minors. And there were cases that went to the Supreme Court in which they said, you know, a state can pass a law saying you have to get your parents' consent. Although they did allow for a judicial process where you could go to a judge, establish that you had the maturity to make the decision. Now, some of you, were under 18 recently. It's not that easy to figure out, like, oh, this is great, I'm just going to figure out how to go to court, to get some health care, right? No problem. Like, you may or may not have access to a car, but that was the Supreme Court's decisions then. What happened with the Casey case is that the court, Roe versus Wade said we're going to put the highest amount of scrutiny on any restrictions on abortion care. Again, these areas of minors and people living on low incomes met that high scrutiny, depriving them of their rights. But what they said in Casey was, we didn't really give enough weight to the developing life of the fetus in our analysis, so we're going to let more restrictions come in because we're going to balance a little bit more in that area. So then came the whole, these had been tried before, but then came a whole bunch of restrictions. 2-trip requirements that you have to go to a clinic, get counseling, go home, think about it, and come back 24 hours later. Biased counseling, which included things like that are not medically true. Like some states passed laws saying you need to tell the patient that there's a link between having an abortion and getting breast cancer. There is no link between having an abortion and getting breast cancer. And so what happens is the doctor does the counseling and then says, I had to tell you that because the state of North Dakota makes me. It's 100% not true. So you have this crazy kind of counseling going on. We've also talked about the fact there are restrictions on who could provide abortion care. Abortion care can actually be safely provided in the first trimester and probably later by other professionals than a doctor. And by, first of all, doctors other than OBGYNs, but also other professionals, nurse midwives, physician's assistants, others all over the world can provide abortion care. And in many states today are also authorized to do so. But those kind of restrictions. Then onerous restrictions on clinics that were shutting them down because they were red tape that they could not comply with. Restrictions on medication abortion. Medication abortion was became available about 20 years ago, and it revolutionized the ability for patients to access care if they wanted to in their, by taking 2 pills in their own home after visiting a doctor, and restrictions on that, restrictions on being able to do that by telemedicine, and then also restrictions on particular abortion methods. All of this is going on. It's increasing around 2010 and comes to a culmination in the last several years. So for many years, the Supreme Court actually stayed away from abortion cases. And then in the last, since 2016, there were 4 cases in the Supreme Court, and including the Dobbs case this year. So in the Dobbs, and this is what I'll say, and let me say one more thing about where things stood. Even before the Dobbs case, so there was legal access, different from ability to pay for and get it in your community, but there was legal access in most states except starting in September of 2001, so about a year ago, because Texas passed a statute that, it's really complicated, there aren't really lawyers in the room, but we'll just put it this way. Texas passed a statute that let every citizen be a vigilante. They said, we're banning abortion at 6 weeks, which was unconstitutional under Roe, and we're going to give anybody the right to be able to enforce that in a civil lawsuit against a doctor, and it shut down services after 6 weeks in the state of Texas. And Oklahoma followed, and so even before the Dobbs case, abortion services were completely shut down in the state of Oklahoma, even without Roe versus Wade being overturned. And the Supreme Court let that happen. That's a story for another day, but that's where we stood before the Dobbs case came down. And the Dobbs decision, the reversing of Roe versus Wade, the consequences were swift and devastating. Currently, over a dozen states have banned abortion. There are not services in vast swaths of the Midwest and in the South. We're still litigating with other organizations around the edges trying to keep clinics open, but that is the state of affairs. And I'll just say a couple things about the Dobbs decision and why it's wrong. And I think it's really important for people to keep in their heads that the decision is wrong. I would say that number one, because we're going to be working at getting that overturned, and it will be overturned someday. It will wind up on the trash heap of history, hopefully also with that Harris versus McRae decision, as others that have been overturned. It had a totally dangerous approach to constitutional interpretation. Being completely simplistic, what it said was, if you didn't have the right in 1868, you can't have the right today. 1868 is the year that the 14th Amendment went into effect, and they basically were saying, we're going to read the Constitution as those who framed it then. First of all, you can obviously tell from the reactions in the room what's wrong with that. Large swath of the American population was emerging from enslavement and didn't have rights. Women didn't have legal rights and recognition or the right to vote under the Constitution. And also, it's wrong even from the perspective of what the 14th Amendment was supposed to mean, and there's a lot of academic literature around the understanding at the time that bodily autonomy, right, freedom from enslavement is about bodily autonomy, and women's experience in slavery with no say over their reproduction was understood to be one of the fundamental liberties about being able to be understood as having that under the 14th Amendment. So wrong on history, wrong as a reading of constitutional interpretation. So 1868, you've got more rights than what somebody thought then. That's what's wrong with it, number one. Two, it didn't even address the harms that were going to come out of the decision. So legislative bodies are discussed 6 times in the decision. Women's bodies are discussed 0 times in the decision. And there was so many briefs, they're called friend of the court briefs, that were submitted from a wide range of perspectives about what was going to be the impact of depriving people of the ability to make the decision whether to go forward with a pregnancy, absolutely absent from the decision. And it's also, other troubling things about the decision is that it threatens other rights in this realm of personal liberty that the government can't enter. Roe versus Wade didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of 50 years that preceded it about understanding this personal liberty under the Constitution to mean things like how you raise your children, about use of contraception. It also built 50 years after, like the legitimacy of same-sex relationships, same-sex marriage. All of this is within this realm of family and personal liberty. They take aim at it. Justice Thomas makes clear in his concurring opinion, that means an opinion that agrees with the result but wants to say some more things. And what he wanted to say some more things about was that the Supreme Court should get rid of all of it. Get rid of all of those liberty cases, re-examine, overturn contraception, same-sex relationships, et cetera, et cetera. So that thread out there is real. And I'll just close with, because we do work around the world, to say that it is out of step. It is out of step with the global trend to liberalize abortion laws. In the last 30 years, 60 countries have liberalized their abortion laws. And abortion has been situated and understood as a gender equality issue. Not just a liberty issue, not just a right to survive life issue, but an issue of fundamental gender equality. And if we think about just recently, if you've been following what's called the Green Wave in Latin America, we saw the Supreme Court of Mexico find that abortion was a right. We saw the Constitutional Court of Colombia say that in the first 24 weeks of pregnancy, you cannot have this criminalized. You saw that Argentina did this as well through the legislature. This whole, and it's not just in Latin America. We just won a case in Kenya establishing again the right to abortion, which is in their constitution. So the US is fundamentally out of step. It's with a handful of countries that are regressing. And so when we get to the discussion, we want to discuss what we're going to do about that.
Absolutely, and thank you, Nancy. And the U.S. Contraceptive access, as well as we were talking earlier, is also largely out of step with the rest of the world. The fact that we can't get contraception over the counter still, despite decades and decades of activism, tells us something very important. So thank you for reminding us of the legal history and breaking it down for us, non-lawyers, the legal history of abortion rights, and also reminding us, I think, a central point of what reproductive justice is, which is that it's not only about abortion rights, but also about the right to have a child. And so you brought that up in your comments around forced sterilization and maternity care. And as you know, we have a maternal health crisis in this country. And so thinking about abortion rights and the right to bear a child and to raise a child in safe conditions are really two sides of the same coin. All right, so next up, I'd like to introduce Lisa Ikemoto, who is Martin Luther King Jr. Professor at UC Davis School of Law, and she holds faculty affiliations with the Ikemoto Center for Race and Nation Studies, the Religious Studies Department, the Master in Public Health Program, and also the Feminist Research Institute at UC Davis. She is also a research associate at the Center for Genetics and Society. Professor Ikemoto's research uses critical race and feminist theories to examine reproductive rights and justice issues, healthcare disparities, and the formation of markets in reproductive and genetic technologies. Examples of her work include the ways in which racism stratifies the regulation of pregnant people in the name of fetal personhood and motherhood, the role of race and class in markets for eggs and surrogacy, the racially disparate impacts of abortion coverage bans under the Affordable Care Act, and the role of religious exemptions in creating reproductive health care deserts. So let's welcome Lisa Ikemoto.
Thank you. I was so pleased to receive the invitation to come here. I've also never been to Rhode Island, and I've always thought of Brown as my dream school, so I get to be a member of the Brown University community for a day or two. So thank you very, very much for the warm welcome. I'm going to start by saying I was born in 1961, which means that I'd hit puberty in 1973 when Roe versus Wade was decided. And at that particular time in my life, I wasn't really paying attention to the headlines or the recent decisions by the Supreme Court. But it was also my privilege to not have to worry about that, right, as I went through puberty. Of course, I worried about lots of other things, including getting pregnant, right? But I also, was aware without having to think about why, right, that I would have a choice, right, about what I would do with that if I did become pregnant then. So, we are at a point in which we're in a crisis. I mean, obviously, there are all kinds of crises going on right now. But it's, going back to the point that Marcela started with, it's not just about abortion, but the abortion right is a linchpin, right, in this much broader, multifaceted, and somewhat coordinated campaign to implement sort of a new regime of social and legal control based on a very narrow social vision for us, socially and politically. So my work for the past 30 years has been using critical race feminism, and in the 1990s, a lot of my work then, I'm not going to sort of recite my work, I just want to pick up a couple of themes from it. A lot of my work then was really focusing on two things that I want to mention now. So one is what I call the ideology of motherhood. So it's not just sort of the idea of becoming a mother or raising children and playing that social role, but sort of all the norms that are attached, right, to this as a social role as defined by the sort of dominant culture, if you will. And what I really focused on sort of was how sort of that ideology would tap into sort of whatever group was being defined as the source of the legal problem of the day, right, in such a way that put a target on them so that those were the bad mothers, right, as opposed to who were being defined as the good mothers. Another aspect of my work really looked at how, and Madina mentioned this when she gave my bio, was looking at the ways that, people with respect to their fertility and with respect to their pregnancies and with respect to their parenting are stratified, right, by race, by their access to wealth or not, by their sexual orientation and gender identity. And those two themes clearly persist. So for example, a day or two ago I read in the news, there's a far-right Christian conservative who's been advocating for an absolute ban in Louisiana. They're almost there. But in response to a question about, what about the person who's pregnant, who wants a pregnancy, but is facing an actual threat, health threat, right, to their life. And he said something, I can't remember the exact words, but sort of saying, well, that's a mother's role, is to self-sacrifice, right? And that's a sort of, right, that is the role. That's sort of, we are supposed to sacrifice, women are supposed to sacrifice, mothers are supposed to sacrifice, not only for their children, right, but for the rest of society as well. That's the burden that's being placed on that. So these two themes persist, both the ideology of motherhood and the target shift from time to time, depending on sort of which group is being deemed the source of the social problem, right? And certainly the stratification piece of it also still persists. But Nancy, right, mentioned sort of this sort of reemergence of a very, very old narrative as well. And you can see it in the Dobbs case. I've been sort of tracking it actually word for word since the Supreme Court decided a case called Gonzalez versus Carhart. And that's the disappearance of the pregnant person in law and within these sort of ideologies that have led to this point in time. So if you read the opinion, the word woman shows up most in the Dobbs opinion because the plaintiff was Jackson Women's Health Organization, not because there was a substantive discussion about the impact, right, of such an abortion restriction in Mississippi on people who are pregnant. There's a little bit of actual discussion, but that's to say, oh, times have changed since this Roe versus Wade. Women have gained so much in society, right, that we don't, in a sense, sort of the right, the sort of purpose of the right has been achieved, right, we're done. And that was it. The rest of it is about really the unborn child, right, the fetus, in other hand. To the extent that women or pregnant people are serviced in these discussions, it's about the justifications for all the restrictions, or many of the restrictions that states have imposed. Reva Siegel uses the term women protective measures. So it's a sort of form of it sort of casts as this form of chivalry, right? We need this law, right, with all these mandated disclosures about these non-true risks, right, of abortion, because women can't tell for themselves. They can't make the decision and understand the information for themselves. We have to step in and protect her or them, right, against themselves. So you see that there, and it's this what it really is this sort of invocation. It's become a sort of a pathway, a channel of pulling in a certain type of morality and this sort of notion of family values into the discussion and into the legal analysis as well. And so what has surfaced as sort of the twin is sort of images are sort of these headless bodies, right, that are bearers, right, for these unborn children, right, and then this sort of moral discourse that surrounds them. And in the meantime, what we also have is in the abortion discourse and in many other discourses, this sort of reframing of this sort of new civil rights, I'm putting in scare quotes. So I am affiliated with a religious studies department. It's not theology. And a lot of my work is actually focused on the role of Catholic doctrine and evangelical Christianity in this discourse. And if you've been paying attention for the past few years, during the Trump administration, they opened a special sort of enforcement office within Health and Human Services to sort of defend providers, healthcare providers, who are claiming that they are discriminated against because they are required to provide comprehensive care, which means reproductive health care in all its different forms to people, and also gender-affirming care, transition care as well. So that's sort of the claim, right? We are the victims of discrimination. You see it in other realms as well. It shows up in the Dobbs case. So for example, in the draft opinion that was leaked by Politico in May, there was sort of a hat tip to an opinion that was written by Justice Thomas in a case called Box. But Thomas wrote a concurring opinion in the Box case in which he described abortion as racial eugenics. So abortion aimed at the black community in order to sort of reduce the number of black people, if you will. They didn't use that phrasing in the final opinion that was issued in late June, but there was a little bit of a reference to it about how this was, in part could be justified as an effort to achieve racial equality, if you will. So it's a sort of reclaiming, right, of these very important, right, civil rights and twisting them, if you will. If you think about sort of what's being done to people with sort of non-binary, traditional cisgender women, man, gender identities, the book bans, right, as you mentioned, the bathroom bans, all those things. That's being done in the name of privacy, right? That's sort of the new privacy right. We need privacy in bathrooms, right, to protect ourselves against those other people, right, who are a physical threat to us. So you get this sort of reframing of all these different things. And again, this is part of even a larger set of issues. So the Dobbs case says, well, the right to abortion is not protected by the Constitution, and in a way that satisfies the goal of some people who are conservatives. So that group of people are advocates of a form of federalism in which most of government's power lies at the state level. So the effect of Dobbs is to say it's up to states to decide whether or not to restrict, ban, or leave abortion accessible in those states, which is why we have California on the one hand, right, and then Mississippi on the other hand. But at the same time, the SAVE movement is using a select set of constitutional rights, right, to sort of move us towards this narrower social vision. So on the one hand, you have, for example, the use of free speech. There was a case decided a few years ago against a law that was passed. It was used to invalidate a law in California, and that law was aimed at what are called pregnancy crisis centers, or crisis pregnancy centers. CPCs. And those hold themselves out to be full reproductive health centers, but they're not. If you go in there and you're pregnant and you're seeking information about what your options are, they tell you about adoption. Or they offer you packages of diapers, right? Things like that, and tell you about all the support you're going to get if you go through with the pregnancy. So the FACT Act that was passed by the California legislature required disclosure. We're not a reproductive health center. And that was knocked down under the First Amendment, right? The free speech. You can't force an entity like that to say something. You can't compel speech by an entity like that. A lot's been done in the name of religious freedom. I'd be happy to talk more about religious exemptions. Certainly we've been focusing on the states that are red and the abortion bans and restrictions that are passing. But it's also true in California that we have abortion deserts. So for example, throughout the Central Valley, you have a lot of one hospital towns, and a lot of those towns have Catholic hospitals. And they're subject to what are called the ethical and religious directives for Catholic health care services. Those rules are not promulgated by doctors, they're promulgated by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. So if you go into the emergency department of a Catholic hospital in Merced, which is in the Central Valley of California, and you're experiencing a miscarriage, they'll tell you you're miscarrying, but we can still detect a fetal heartbeat. So we're going to send you home. Because if we do anything, right, if we give you methotrexate, if we do a D&C, which is standard medical care for someone experiencing a miscarriage, then that counts as an abortion under the ERD's ethical and religious directives. So religious freedom has become this huge, huge umbrella for much of this activity. So I'm probably close to my time. We all said we only needed 10 minutes, and Madina said, no, you're going to talk for longer. She was right. So the other aspect I always say is that certainly you've got sort of effort to sort of broaden the scope of some of the rights, the examples that I just give you, but also attacks on other critical rights. And Marcela talked about the attacks on voting rights, for example. And you have to think about sort of how all this sort of fits together. It means that all of these intersect with both reproductive rights and with reproductive justice as well. And that means that almost any role that you take, right, to address these as an advocate in any form will help.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lisa, for bringing home the important role of gender ideology, as well as the goal of social and political control in all of these debates. So thank you for that. So thank you to our excellent panelists. It is now time for a question and answer from the audience. So please start thinking of your question, and while you do that, I will pose one question that I'm really interested in hearing the panelists' thoughts about, that really centers the key role of reproductive justice in creating connections across important social issues and movements that include bodily autonomy, resource allocation, and the fight against multiple forms of oppression. And so you all talked about these issues in various ways, but getting concrete and practical in terms of what are we going to do? Can you tell us a little bit about how cross-movement, cross-issue alliances, solidarities can help us get to the vision of reproductive justice and make it a reality?
I don't know if it's still on. I think it is. I'll just give you a couple of examples. What we would call the civil rights movement, the organizations, Nessa, you called them something.
Legacy civil rights organizations.
Groups have traditionally shied away from talking about abortion and until the Dobbs decision. And then they basically had an awakening, is the best I can put it. Partly because of the membership, which was, the civil rights organizations have always been, their backbone has always been black women. And they started saying, well, wait a minute. It's time, folks. It's time, guys. And what we have had is that the civil rights groups, the National Urban League, NAACP, well, the leadership conference was always there. I mean, people who, traditionally worked on what they call civil rights issues, which included voting rights, all of a sudden started reaching out to repro organizations and saying, maybe we should talk. And maybe we should visit the White House together, and maybe we should visit the Department of Justice together. And they did, and we did. And it's a different type of things when you walk in and you're talking about abortion rights, and with you is the National Urban League and the NAACP. I spoke at the NAACP's national board meeting where they had a resolution that was specifically about the Dobbs decision. And they kept saying, now, here's what's going to happen, Marcela. There's a lot of people who are faith-based people here, and so we want you to really talk about faith-based stuff and how it intersects and everything like that. I'm going okay, fine. There wasn't a single person on that board who disputed any of it. And what it really told me is they just hadn't brought the issue before them before. And all of a sudden, it was smack in their face, and they had no other choice, and they voted, and there wasn't a dissenting opinion anywhere. And since then, I've now been talking to all these chapters as well, because they want to know what to do in their states. And so it wasn't so much that we needed, they were not there. We just needed to have a galvanizing movement that sort of raised it up. So with civil rights groups, environmental rights groups have been there a little bit earlier around certain things, around, for instance, black maternal health. Because the reality is that the issue around clean water and heat impacts pregnant women and pregnant people. It is, heat index in the summer is really high if you are pregnant. And it is not a joke that people sit in front of air conditioning turned all the way up when they are in their last trimester of pregnancy, because your body is out of whack. And so environmental justice groups knew that. Environmental rights groups knew that. And of course, issues around clean water have been coming up. It wasn't just Flint. It was a lot of different cities that have this clean water problem. And so Flint was the one that galvanized everybody. So there are things like that. There's the mental health, people who work on mental health, people who work in housing. All of those movements have now sort of come together to say, I had a meeting with HUD to talk about housing, because the thing about, if you criminalize people because of abortion, then you also exclude them from being able to get public housing. So which means they get kicked out of public housing, because you can't have a felony and be in public housing. So there were those kind of things. So the housing piece has popped up. And so HUD is now having a lot of discussions with groups around the criminalization, around abortion. So it's all of those kind of pieces. I mean, basically, we've got a whole reproductive justice alignment that's happening. And it's well-timed. Unfortunately, it took the overturning of Roe to get there, but it is actually happening, and people are just going, oh, maybe we need to work on this together. Maybe we need to work on this together. And so you do have those kind of things happening. We recently worked with 30 Black women's organizations to develop a document called the Black Reproductive Justice Policy Agenda, which we took all of those 25 issues that we wanted members of Congress and the White House to put an RJ lens on. And it covered, the sexual and reproductive health pieces, but it also covered, violence against women, it covered housing, it covered LGBTQ liberation issues. It covered a wide variety of issues, and we made it into a document, and we've been working it through the Congress. And now we're designing state-based pieces to take to the states. But it literally does say, here's the lens you should be looking at this stuff on. You need to put a face on the policies you're passing. And we're, next year, we're shifting a whole bunch of attention to the states. We were already shifting some in the states because we have these state partners, but it's a policy piece now that we're shifting there, not just an activist piece and an organizing piece. So it's all there. I mean, as I said, police reform, housing, but it's a wide variety. Reproductive health technology pieces that, for the most part, low-income people don't have access to. Again, because of insurance issues and stuff like that. So looking at those kind of things. So,
All right, I'll pick up with that
Okay.
example, actually.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'll give you two examples. So one is, I do a lot of work on the fertility industry, meaning sort of the industry, and I'm saying industry intentionally because it's a multi-billion-dollar industry just within the U.S. So that sort of offers things like in vitro fertilization, surrogacy, sort of so to address infertility or enable people to have children through high-tech means. And as Marcela said, it's expensive, right? And so it's only for people who have disposable income or credit. And a lot of people do that. They take out a second on their house, or they sell something big, right? Or they max out their credit cards. So it's not just the super wealthy, but you have to have some means to use it. So one of the impacts is that it's well known, it's long been known that the highest rates of infertility are among low-income people. And so yet there's this focus, right, on fertility treatment for people who are not low-income people, right? And you have to be able to afford the technologies. The other aspect that I think that's important to keep in mind is that, so this is where I write about reproductive stratification, is because the use of many of these technologies depends on people who are positioned as third parties, so people who provide the sperm, the eggs, and the gestational services in order to sort of maximize their chances of having a child to the raise. So all of you, right, who are the students, you're the prime targets of the advertising, right? They want your eggs, right? And for good reason, right? You're young, you're healthy, you're part of the young invincibles. And a lot of you need money, right? And that's what the offer is. And there's a different class of people who become surrogates. So during the last Great Recession, the fertility market turned around and they were targeting military spouses because you're in place for a year or two. Many of the people who've moved there with a spouse who's on active duty, it's difficult for them to sort of maintain access to education or develop any kind of career. Many of them have young children. And the amount of money that they get for going through a pregnancy on someone else's behalf is more than they could make. In many of these towns are sort of minimum wage jobs are only available. So those technologies, right, depend on wealth stratification, right, and the ready availability of that as well. Second example, really, really quickly, is that for any issue, right, that's a crisis right now, we should always be thinking about it through a reproductive justice lens. If you think about all the work that communities are trying to do to minimize and prevent the effects of gun violence. So it's, there's now good data showing that exposure to gun violence, even if you're not sort of a direct victim, right, but being sort of near it or living with it, right, increases premature births. So there are direct impacts on reproductive health, if you will. So anyway.
And I guess just very quickly, what I would add on to what Lisa and Marcela said is that, you know, one thing that's, for those of us who do work in the courts, bringing everybody together is we're all getting slammed by the Supreme Court. And we're getting slammed by the reading. I talked about how they're reading, this originalist reading, into constitutional cases or very narrow reading in other areas. And they have a unified theory about how to think about it. And we, who work on issues, whether it's about the environment, racial justice, economic justice, reproductive justice, also need to have a unified reading. And that reading of the Constitution, so originalism, which is you got the rights you had when they thought about amending the Constitution at the particular time that they did, is what they have been pressing for generations. You know, an alternative reading of the Constitution is that it should be read in a pro-democracy way. Now that makes sense because it's a democratic instrument. And what do I mean by reading it in a pro-democracy way? You read it in a way that what would most advance a thinking about equality and dignity of each person in the political society in which we read. So if we go back to thinking about that Harris versus McRae case, instead of reading the Constitution to say, you know, so sad, too bad, you would read it to say, well, you know, if we think about whether a government program has to be something that allows everyone to access it, we're going to have a program that we're going to uphold and not strike down the law. So that is something that anything you're working on, because believe me, coming up this Supreme Court term will be some more cases that are going to be pretty devastating and bad for an equal society. And, you know, we live in a multiracial, multi-religious, gender diverse, sexual orientation diverse society. And that is not the way the Supreme Court is reading the U.S. Constitution, which is built to be able to sustain such a society.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for addressing my question. And now it's all of your turn. I see some excited hands. Do we have a mic? Yes, right here, right in front.
Thank you. I'll stand. So first, I just want to thank you all for being here. It means a tremendous amount. I hope that this makes sense. I think I mostly just want to hear your thoughts, and so I'll give a bunch of my thoughts as prompts. I'm a peer sex educator both on campus and in the Providence area in public schools. This is work that I'm tremendously passionate about. I actually have to run a few minutes to go set up for an event we're having tonight. And I've noticed just across the board with various students I've worked in, both here, both back home in California, that the stigma and shame around sex and sexuality and everything that's related to it is uniform and ubiquitous and very, very, very difficult to pierce through. And the link between that and the amount of misinformation that is out there, as well as the sort of puritanistic and regressive laws that are being passed, seems abundantly clear to me. So I guess what I'm wondering is, what do you think about the connection between cultural beliefs and governance, and what does that look like in relationship to reproductive justice? And I mean, I guess that is to say, like, where do you see gaps in activism, lobbying, legal efforts for reproductive justice? Where are the major barriers, and how do you approach legal work surrounding a subject that's particularly intimate and figured as personal and private? I know that was a lot that doesn't necessarily have like a unified,
That was huge.
like, it's like a whole nother lecture worth of information, but
It's a great question.
and I'm just
great
guessing,
question.
what was the first thing that came to mind is my question. Thank you.
Well, I'll maybe just say something about the first thing that came to mind to me, which is, and it reminds me when I would speak at Parents Weekend, I don't know what it was, maybe it was 10 years ago. But I then did, as I did here, which is often ask, you know, who's in the room, who's students or parents. In that case, there were lots of parents, Parents Weekend, this or that. You know, and I might ask how many people have, you know, taken a pregnancy to term, right? And I would never say, how many people have had an abortion, right? And I'm not going to do that because we live in a because it's so stigmatized, not because there should be anything wrong with having like the same show of hands. As we know, 1 in 4 women, that's the demographic, that will have an abortion in their lifetime in the United States. It used to be 1 in 3, like 2 generations ago, or a generation ago it was 1 in 3. Now it's 1 in 4, because contraceptive use is better. So that's the stigma that you're dealing with. And that is, I think, one of the biggest challenges, because often when you do what we do, I know all kinds of things. A mother came, and I told them at the end of this to go, when they went to dinner tonight, because it was Parents' Week, and I knew they were all going to dinner, to talk about why you came today. Somebody brought somebody, right? Either the parent brought the student or the student brought the parent, but somebody brought somebody to have that conversation. And a woman in the audience came up to me and she said, you know, my daughter and I have both had an abortion, but she doesn't know about mine. You know, I supported her when she had an abortion when she was, I think, 15 or 16. And that's the kind of like, it's hard to think about other issues where there's so much that's not even known and discussed within families, it wasn't that she wasn't supportive, it was just that she made the decision at the time that she didn't think her 15-year-old daughter could keep information private, not tell the whole world, and she still wanted to be private about that decision. But so it is a challenge, and I think it's fantastic that you're a peer sex educator, because that is a realm in the culture where things are being sort of broken down. But I think lots that everybody else could add to your well-packed question.
You know, it's interesting that very often we leave out the sexual and part of the sexual and reproductive health piece, and we need to always include it, because the stigma is on that sexual and it has always been on it. You know, people, and the way conservatives win at that is they make this parents should have the right to, as opposed to students should have the right to information. Parents should have the right to what their kids learn in school. And you kind of go like, no, you don't. You know, you educate your kids in math, you educate them, you teach them how to read, you educate them, well, we used to educate them in American history. Now I'm not sure what we're educating them in. But the reality is that if you really want to prepare kids for life as an adult, you want to teach them all these things. You don't have to, you don't have to sit there with a banana and a condom. But you do have to talk about, age-appropriate sexuality issues. And that's really what comprehensive sex ed. I used to work for Advocates for Youth, and we talked about sexual and reproductive health all the time, but there's a comprehensive sexual education that includes age-appropriate things. When do you talk, at what age do you talk about different things about sex? And one of the things, even just to start, is at least teaching your child the real names for genitalia. I mean, as opposed to calling them something else. And there are all kinds of names for them. It's something else. And some people, as adults, still call them something else. And the reality is that they shouldn't know. What you don't want is people to be in college and have no clue about what they're doing when it comes to their bodies. You don't want to have that. And so one of the things we always used to say is, it would be nice if kids actually talk to their parents about sex, but very often they don't. They're sexually active and their parents haven't a clue, because they've talked to friends, they've gone on the internet and gotten real misinformation. They've, I remember talking to a group of high school kids, and one of them told me that she had gone out and gotten birth control pills and shared them with her friends. And I was like, that's not what you're supposed to do with those. She says, oh yeah, we just divided them. I'm like, okay, let's have a real kind of, that's the kind of stuff that, because you don't know. If somebody's not telling you, you think, okay, well, they said I should take these pills, and so I took one before I had sex. You go, and then what? Really simple things like that. And so that's part of this, what you're talking about is, and there are southern states that actually mandate abstinence only. That's all you can teach. But what they leave out as part of that teaching is also talking about condoms negatively, talking about birth control pills negative. So it's not really abstinence only. It's giving out bad. It's like the the counseling that you were mandated to do if you're a doctor. It's the same thing. It's giving out bad information, and why we have these hang-ups about that, I do not know, but we clearly do and still do. But it is a good idea if you can, if people haven't had, you can always go to a clinic and they'll tell you all kinds of stuff about sex. But one would think that that's what parents would do, but they're as nervous about it as, the kids are, because their parents didn't tell them either. And so it just perpetuates through generations, and somewhere it just needs to stop. Kids should just go in and say, okay, Mom, it's time we had the sex talk. And the mother will fall over flat on her back, like, what? Let's get your dad in here. He can talk to you. Yeah, because, they want to have that conversation, but they're afraid to raise it.
I was going to go theoretical, but I think we should end there.
Okay, excellent. Thank you all. Any other questions? I think I saw a hand around here. Yes, please.
There's a mic.
Mic's coming.
Hi, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for being here. I've learned so much. So I grew up in like a rural Georgia conservative town, and I was always really shocked by the misinformation that I would hear getting spread whenever we would talk about reproductive rights in class. Something I would hear all the time was people would say, I heard in California, you can get an abortion after the baby is born. Which I was but that was something I heard all the time. So I'm just wondering, what role do you think that misinformation in the media played in this decision? And I'm also wondering, is that the difference, and why this decision, 50 years later, was overturned? How big of a role did the media have in that?
So, yeah, I'm not sure it's not just the media, right? I mean, popular culture and the ability of the antis to wield those means of communication are part of it. I've been doing a lot of teach-ins with medical students, and medical students hear about the Dobbs case, and they said, well, maybe if they could just sit down with a group of health educators or doctors so that they could get, straight on the facts, that would help. And we said, so of all the briefs, a lot of them had a lot of information, right? The egg moves down the fallopian tube, right? They knew. They had the information available. So I think it's not just misunderstanding, at least not on the part of the court, but willful disregard of it. You see that in the statute. So the statute that was upheld by the court in the Dobbs case and then led to the decision by this super right majority of the Supreme Court to overrule Roe versus Wade, they recited all the misstatements of facts that were part of that statute. So the statute opens with misstatements about at what point fetuses feel pain, or what is it that women experience, those kinds of things. So I think I think it's a really good question to ask, because a lot of this fight is culture. The term culture wars is apt in a way. And so, there's been really a good effort by the advocates for reproductive rights and for reproductive justice to create the, more accurate and counter narratives. But it's still, right, it's still ongoing.
Yes, please. Oh, one sec.
I'm class of 65, so I might be the oldest one in the room. I have one comment and then one question. My comment is Professor Ikemoto's reference to this newfound chivalry, and I'm reminded of the cases 100 years ago when the Supreme Court held that state laws that limited the number of hours women could work were okay because, these were women, even though that impaired their ability to earn a living. Those cases were later overruled, but this modern chivalry reminds us of 100 years ago.
Yeah.
It's horrible. I have a question for Marcela Howell. I thought your discussion of reproductive justice as encompassing at least 27 aspects of people's lives was informative and important. The question I have, though, is how do we get any focus if what you gave to Congress and the White House had 27 aspects in it? And how does your organization focus? And how do you want the rest of us to focus?
Well, the reason it had that many issues was because for too long, remember, 1994 was when the term reproductive justice was coined. Part of the problem is that it was coined at a pro-choice conference where the entire focus then went to abortion and family planning. And the part that is part of reproductive justice that says the right to have a child, the right not to have a child, and the right to raise the children you have in a safe and healthy environment, that's the part that didn't get covered, and it didn't follow through history. That part that says, in order to raise your child in a healthy and safe environment, all of these other issues that impact your life have to be addressed. So when we went to Congress, basically we went to Congress and talked about Black maternal health. We talked about housing issues to people who work on housing issues in Congress. We talked about issues around violence against women with people who were introducing bills and who were the champions of reauthorizing violence against women. We went to those members whose issues were in that document and said, here's how we can work with you. Here's how this becomes, and here's how you need to talk about this if you want to put an RJ lens on it. And so we gave them the talking points. It's in the document, and then we developed talking points behind it to give them so they could actually stand up there and talk to their colleagues about the issue they were trying to put over. We even did talking points around COVID and how it factored in all these different issues as well.
Is your organization allowed to be politically active, or are you barred from political activity? Or do you have
Now, what do you mean by political? We're always politically active, but if you mean by like electoral active, no, we are a 501c3, and somewhere this month we might become a 501c4. The IRS is a little slow, but our lawyers say that we're in that group right now for this month. But we are allowed to do lobbying. We are allowed to basically put in front, we have what they call an H election, which basically says we can devote a certain amount of our budget to lobbying. We can't do the kind of candidate stuff. We can't do the kind of party stuff that other groups, that's a C4. We can't do those kind of things, which is why we decided we needed a C4. But the issue around talking to these members of Congress about the issues and about how reproductive justice surrounds all of them, we can do. And we do, quite a bit. So.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, back there.
My question is, how do we get more cis white men to care about these issues and also to be involved in this work without overshadowing the work that women of color have been doing for so long?
Is that directed at me? I was going to say, because I don't know. Oh, no, right. Actually, I do know. I take that back. I was being flippant. In our polling, we poll Black women and Black men. In our work with some other organizations that do poll much broader than what we do, They have found that white men, especially younger white men, well, I shouldn't say that. It depends on where they live. And it depends on like family background too. But there are a lot of white men who are, who do support what we're doing. And we saw them at the day the Dobbs decision came down. But we also saw some really like not supportive people who were young white men, but also young black men who were on the wrong side. And, I don't really have a conversation with them very much. But they're there. You just have to be willing and brave enough to talk to them, to get them to go like, oh yeah, no, I support this, absolutely. But the polling has shown that they're very supportive. The Dobbs decision did something to people. It knocked them off the fence. And it knocked them off the fence regardless of their sex and their gender. It really did. It made people stand up and go like, oh my God, people have been telling us this was going to happen for years, and whoops, there it is. Because they didn't really expect it. And people still, even with the people who were on the Supreme Court, we all kept saying, they won't really overturn a 49-year-old president with the Nancy can talk to that though. Because people really didn't think the court would be just that bad. But they were put there to be just that bad. We forgot, 3 Trump people. Yeah, they were going to be that bad because they had others waiting in the wings for, a supermajority. And there they had them. So, yeah. And it's going to get worse this next term. Remember, the term starts in October. So who knows what they might do. Did that answer your? Okay.
It's a thought. Can I just say, I thought it's a good question you ask. Those of us who've been around for a long time, variations of that question have been asked for a long time. If we look around the room today in the audience, I'm not talking about people who are maybe working the room, but people in the audience, I'm not identifying any cisgendered white males. So I'm interested in what your generation thinks. I mean, when I used to teach reproductive health and human rights at Columbia Law School, I would change the title constantly to see if I could get a different demographic in the room. But in 5 years, I had one guy take the course. So I'm interested in what you all think. You're here, you're students, you're engaged with other people your age demographic. What do you think?
I think it's changing. Because my class demographic is different than yours.
That's good.
Yeah. And I think you're right, it was Dobbs, right? Where people started thinking about, it was like the campaign that the breast cancer advocates used, right? Breast cancer is so prevalent that you always know, and they did this, right, to get men on board with supporting research and funding for breast cancer to fight it. It's your mother, it's your sister, right? It's your daughter, it's your best friend. So it affects, even if it doesn't sort of affect you directly, it affects you through your relationships.
Thank you.
And it can affect you. I mean, breast cancer. So
That's
Yes,
true.
but
Yes.
Yeah.
Might have got some traction. Yes.
So thank you so much for being here and educating us. I really appreciate it. I'm not from the US, so it's really interesting for me to listen to this conversation. I had a question about civil disobedience because I'm wondering if the legal system is doing all these things. Are there any healthcare providers or doctors who are we don't want to do that. We do what we think is right? What will protect our women? Yeah.
I'm going to take that first because we represent a lot of doctors, and I think there is certainly a role for civil disobedience. The challenge for healthcare providers is that the criminal sanctions are out of sight. So, you know, used to be if you're going and you're protesting and you might get arrested and you're going to spend some time, say a month or so or whatever, maybe less. I mean, in the state of Texas, the penalty for providing an abortion is up to 99 years in prison. And that is 99 years in prison. And that is just too much for someone to ask to take us in a country that now says there's no right, constitutional right that you're exercising. The state of Texas doesn't recognize it as a constitutional right. So you may be facing 99 years in prison. So I think the social movement has to think about civil disobedience, but I think to expect, and the thing is, I'll just say it's one more thing, because people kept saying that when Texas, you know, shut down under the vigilante law, it's not just the provider, right? The provider would be asking their you know, their nursing staff, their security staff, their front desk staff, and that is just too much to ask.
Yeah. The statute mentions the insurers, right?
Right.
True. No Medicaid coverage.
All right, other questions? Yes.
Thank you all so much. Another international question, perspective here. I have a niece who is considering coming to the US for university. And when I was at home this summer going through her list, for the first time, I had this distinct feeling of obligation, because I was also teaching a Zoom class called Gender and Technologies. And during the weeks in June when all this went down and my class online was melting down, I was also talking to my niece about the possibility of coming to the US. And I think this goes to something that you were inviting us to ask about, which is the international, not just the perception, but also, it's hard to explain to folks how different life can be depending on the state you are in the US, because the United really does figure in the imaginary as some kind of actual unity, and it takes a lot of explaining, if you haven't lived here, to understand how different the experience in different parts of this country can be. And of course, this has been the lived reality for a very long time. It's not new, but I feel like we are moving in a direction of this further disparity. And thank you so much, Professor Ikemoto, for quelling some of the sort of, you know, California glory to remind us that there are other ways in which, you know, rights are being limited, even in the, you know, most progressive spaces and places in this country. And so I guess I'm asking about the future. And I know that for you who have this sort of vested interest in changing it, you maybe are not as pessimistic as I am from this side, but from this side, it really feels like it really matters where you are in this country, to the point where I will like strike universities off my niece's list for not academic reasons, for not opportunities at that university, for not even about their need-blind status for international students. None of that matters, because she will be 18 when she arrives in this country, and sexually active, potentially. We haven't talked about that. And it's just not something that I want her to have to deal with. And she's, you know, arriving here with a significant amount of privilege, very different from a lot of folks who are even growing up in those states. So are we going to see movement to the other states? Are we going to see the rift between the states ever widen? This like mythology of California as devil to some and savior to others, is that going to amplify? What are your thoughts on this? Really genuinely interested to know.
I'll just start by saying we don't know. I mean, I think one of the things in this fight ahead is to just have a whole lot of humility about we just don't know things. However, a few things I would say is that, you know, and Marcela talked about this, I mean, the Dobbs decision is so unpopular. Like, we cannot underscore how unpopular it is across the country. And we didn't talk today about Kansas. And the fact that the Center for Reproductive Rights won a lawsuit 4 years ago establishing the right to abortion under the Kansas State Constitution. The conservative legislature thought this is a great idea, summer of 2022, we'll put it on the ballot in August when nobody's going to come out and vote. And they came out in droves and said, no, we want to keep our rights. So I think the potential, I think there's potential in both scenarios that you're saying. I do think we are splitting, we've always been split apart as a country. But this is certainly wedging strongly. But I think there's also the potential for people are going to live under an unacceptable regime. And so I think that is going to provide opportunity for change that we haven't seen during a time when the court was there as a backup for rights.
We have a program that works with activists on HBCU campuses, and it's a fellowship program that we have 12 students for 2 years, and they do forums and stuff. And we had the orientation for the new class. And normally I just talk about the history of In Our Own Voice and what we do and everything like that. Every single question was about the schools that they were getting ready to go to, and in the states that they were in. And people were asking me questions. Well, I'm going to school in Louisiana, and I live in California, but I'm going to school in Louisiana. What about my ability to get birth control pills filled there? What about my bill? And that's what they were looking at, because they were like, okay, wait, I live in Washington, D.C., but I'm going to school in Texas. Now, all of them who were going to school in Texas are not going to school in Texas anymore. So there was that became very clear. They didn't want to go to school in Texas. But it was that discussion because they had gotten scholarships to certain HBCUs. They were planning on going, and then the Dobbs decision happened. And so what they wanted to know, what do I do if this happens? What do I do if this happens? And we had to talk about that. What are your options and stuff? But none of the questions were about the forums they were going to do on campus, and when do we, and they get paid. This is a paid fellowship. What days do we get paid? None of that, which is what normally it was all about this, the school they were going to be in and the state they were going to be in. So it was a much longer discussion than it was supposed to be, but it was that. Students are thinking about that too. And the reality is, it's not just the state, because you can be in some states and the areas that you are in might be horrible, or if it's a public hospital that used to be there and now it's a Catholic institution, that will change a lot in terms of the care you get. So there's all those things. And as Nancy said, we don't really know. I don't want to scare you about your niece coming to school. She's still coming.
Really, I want to thank you for educating us. It's such a resource to have you here, all four of you. I want to ask on behalf of all of us, we are a campus community, teachers and students, and I certainly know that on my own behalf of my students, I feel paralysis. What can we do as a campus community? What can we do to create safe spaces, education, and this sense of creative civil disobedience? Because I think this is one way, having a conversation. And thank you all for coming and staying. It really, really matters, I think. But,
Well, you're at an academic institution.
Yeah.
You can start.
I mean, there's lots of things. So most of the sort of talking that I'm doing right now is actually to student groups. So the student orgs are pushing these discussions out. So, you know, the next time I'm sort of in front of a group of people, it's because the student body at UC Davis has sort of a team on gender identity issues. So they set up a panel to talk about both reproductive rights and sort of what do we do after Roe. So for the students, right, you can use your power as students, right? And it could be because you're creative, right? It could be through your coursework, right, in the art department or whatever it is. You can raise the questions, right, in class. How does this relate to? So you can change, you know, the content of the course yourself. The reason I teach reproductive rights and justice, the seminar, is because after I joined the faculty at UC Davis, the students, they have the opportunity to create sort of kind of a student-led course, but they need a faculty advisor. So they had a plan. They had me serve as faculty advisor the first year, and then they submitted a petition to have it added as a permanent basis into the curriculum. So you can demand courses, right? So I think there's a number of things. You have forums, right? But some of you might feel more comfortable acting on an individual basis or through something more formal, like an organization.
And I would underscore the reason I started teaching reproductive health and human rights at Columbia Law School in 2006 was because a student petition had demanded that they have that course, a course on that on campus. Now, what I did is they thought they were going to get a course in U.S. constitutional law, or as I used to say, the course on like Roe, was it rightly decided? And I was like, I'm not teaching that class. So I showed up at the faculty appointments committee discussion about the class I wanted to teach on international human rights law. We did also obviously look at some of the U.S. case law, but I wanted people to come in and start, the first part of the course was on emergency obstetrics care, surviving pregnancy, why that's a fundamental human right, cases that have been decided on that, and move through before we were talking about abortion. But so I think that's right, and I would also underscore the point about, this gets back to the point about stigma, it gets back to the point about, you know, where are the guys? Be visible and influential in every sphere that you can. So, you know, you might have a student, you know, organization that hasn't yet engaged about, wait a minute, is there something about the Dobbs decision and the overturning of this constitutional right that might actually impact what we're trying to do in our particular student group? Think about who and what you can influence and how you can influence. So every single I would do not despair. You know, there's no reason to. I mean, we're on the right side of history, okay? So everybody has to be committed to do what they need to do every single day. But do what is, like, what gives you joy for the fight? Because it's a long one, and that's what's going to keep you going in it. So it's my 2 cents.
I love that. So inspiring. Thank you. Other questions or comments? Yes, in the back.
For context, I'm a senior doing gender sexuality studies at Brown, and I'm doing an honors thesis on crisis pregnancy centers in Rhode Island. So it's currently in the works, but I just wanted to know what you guys thought about like crisis pregnancy centers and like what can be done, especially due to the fact that most of their funding comes from the Catholic Church and other religious organizations. And yeah, so my project is basically on like the misinformation and the harm that they inflict on other communities, especially the ones that they're based in. But yeah, I just wanted to know like what your thoughts on CPCs were and just any ideas for like how to get kind of infiltrated into those organizations, but also not hurt myself in the process.
That's good.
Well, crisis pregnancy centers are, well, first I want to go back to the law that Nancy mentioned, because I worked with one of the organizations in California who developed that law, and it was while Harris was Attorney General and stuff. And they would develop the law specifically to address the fact that the crisis pregnancy centers advertised as something other than what they were, and that under California law, anyone who basically acted as if they were a health care clinic had to provide whoever came in with all the information about California healthcare system and laws that existed there. Now, the problem that came up was there's a right to know for anyone who walks in to get information. The crisis pregnancy centers, however, made the argument that it was about religious freedom and that they didn't have to do all that because they were a religious entity. And they won. They won, because it was this particular Supreme Court. Crisis pregnancy centers don't just get their money from Catholic Church. There's a lot of states that provide them with money as well. And that's part of the problem as well, that a lot of the same states that have been doing the abortion bans also provide funding to the crisis pregnancy centers. And they're now, and they used to just target like low-income communities. They're kind of branching out now because Roe has now been overturned, so they're branching out to basically target wherever young people are. So, don't be surprised if one of them pops up in, I don't know if they'll come to Rhode Island, but maybe. But they'll pop up around colleges as well. And they're also now talking about having medical professionals in there, where that was one of the things that they were criticized for. But they're now talking about having medical professionals in who will talk to them about medical. Doesn't mean that they're going to give them factual data, but they will have somebody there who has some training, medical training. So it might be a nurse, it might be someone, might be a doctor, likely not, because they don't actually perform any services there other than taking pregnancy tests and stuff. So it might be a nurse who then talks to them about, and they always talk about the gestation of the fetus, and of course technology now gives you, like, you can look at a fetus through the 3D stuff and see a much different piece. But they never talk about your options. They're not going to. And then they'll tell you they can offer diapers and bottles and things like that. And and I think the question that anybody who goes in there should ask is, are you going to be around for 18 years? Because you're asking me to carry a pregnancy to term and then raise someone for 18 years. And that's the key piece. And if you noticed, a lot of the people who were being interviewed after the Dobbs decision were people who ran crisis pregnancy centers. And they were talking about how, well, now we really have to concentrate on both, what's good for the mother and for the child. And, and of course the media, gets to your question about the media, forget who asked, the media question, which is, they talk about, well, there are two sides to this issue. And you kind of said, yeah, there's the side that says women should have bodily autonomy, and there's the side that says, no, politicians should control what you do. That's not two sides to the same issue. But that's what the media is doing. And so the Crisis Pregnancy Center people are learning how to talk about this issue now differently than they used to. Differently than they used to when the California law was passed. So they've learned some lessons. I don't know, Nancy,
I would also just add to it, some of the public policy routes have failed. We tried to enact them and they came back. So, use your own First Amendment rights. You can leaflet in front of crisis pregnancy centers and say, this center doesn't provide full information about the full range of reproductive health care activities. So don't forget, we've got First Amendment rights too.
Yeah, what you should do, you're writing a thesis. Write the thesis in a way that's accessible. Give it to the Providence Journal and the Boston Globe. Work with every local community group you can find that's interested in this issue and expose them. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, and you, who are writing a thesis, can do that. And make sure that your thesis isn't just, forgive me, academically oriented. Write it in plain, accessible language, have it translated into Spanish and every other language that it needs to be translated into in Rhode Island, and get out there and do something.
On that note, and thank you to all the students who have shown up, and I know you all are extremely active on the Brown campus. I've heard about all the great work that you do around peer sex education, but also fighting for reproductive rights and justice. So thank you all for doing the work every day and for showing up today. I think that's all we have time for, so I will turn it over to Leela, but please join me in thanking our panelists once again.
But to thank from the bottom of my heart Professor Agénor, Marcela Howell, Professor Ikemoto, and Nancy Northup for sharing so generously of their time and expertise today. It really means a lot, and it means a lot to have you all here and to be community with us. So thank you. Have an excellent evening.